Have you ever wondered why some people seem untouchable, unaffected by criticism, rejection, or emotional wounds, while others spiral at the slightest comment or perceived slight? According to Carl Jung, the answer isn't found in external circumstances, but in the depths of our inner world. From childhood, we learn to define ourselves through the eyes of others. Approval and acceptance become essential nutrients for our emotional well-being. Rejection, criticism, and abandonment then become devastating, not because they necessarily reflect reality, but because they threaten our sense of self-worth. Carl Jung understood this process profoundly. He taught that the greatest journey anyone could undertake is inward, to confront, understand, and accept the hidden parts of oneself. In his words, your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. This awakening isn't merely about becoming aware of your inner world. It's about developing emotional immunity against external triggers. Consider your emotional reactions. Why does criticism hurt? Why do certain words or behaviors from others affect you so deeply, while others remain insignificant? Jung argued that these intense reactions reflect not the strength of the other's words, but the unresolved issues within yourself. The emotional pain is never entirely about what someone else says or does. It's about what their actions confirm or ignite within your subconscious. For instance, when someone tells you that you're not good enough, the pain isn't solely about their opinion. It's about your hidden fear of inadequacy, a fear you might have nurtured unconsciously for years. Jung described this phenomenon as encountering your shadow. The shadow represents everything you've pushed away, ignored, or rejected about yourself, your fears, insecurities, shame, and pain. It's not an enemy, but a hidden part of your psyche demanding attention and integration. So, the reason people hurt you emotionally isn't that their words are inherently powerful. It's because their words activate your shadow. They uncover what you've kept buried. In essence, the hurt comes not from outside, but from inside. This insight changes everything. It means your emotional resilience doesn't rely on how kind or cruel others are. It depends on your relationship with your shadow. Jung proposed that healing emotional wounds requires courage, the courage to turn inward and face your deepest vulnerabilities. When someone criticizes you and it triggers pain, you can ask yourself, what truth about myself is this reaction showing me? This doesn't excuse others' harmful behaviors. Rather, it empowers you to reclaim responsibility for your emotional state. Imagine what life could feel like if criticism bounced off you like water off a duck's back, if rejection became merely information rather than a judgment of your worth. That is the emotional freedom Jung described, the kind of freedom achievable only when you know yourself intimately, including your darkest corners. Here's the catch: inner work isn't comfortable. It forces you to question long-held beliefs, confront deep-seated fears, and dismantle narratives you've clung to for comfort. Yet, it's precisely this discomfort that leads to authentic strength. You learn that pain doesn't have to dictate your reactions. You learn to respond consciously rather than unconsciously. Jung's wisdom teaches us that emotional vulnerability is a choice, albeit often unconscious. When your sense of worth isn't dependent on external validation, when your inner world is understood and integrated, nothing and no one can ever truly harm you again. This realization is more than psychological theory. It's profoundly practical. If you struggle with emotional sensitivity, you may believe the solution lies in surrounding yourself with kind, respectful people. While supportive relationships certainly matter, lasting emotional strength comes from within. No environment can shield you from every hurtful experience, but inner work equips you to handle them differently. Jung emphasized this repeatedly. True resilience isn't about hardening yourself against life's challenges. It's about softening toward yourself. It's about accepting and integrating the very parts of you that others' words or actions trigger. When you stop fighting your shadow and start embracing it, external provocations lose their power. This isn't about ignoring feelings or numbing yourself to life's complexities. On the contrary, Jung encouraged facing emotions head-on, feeling them fully, but without being controlled by them. He believed that the more conscious you become of your inner landscape, the less power external circumstances have to destabilize you. Thus, the promise isn't that you'll never experience hurt again, but that hurt won't break you. It becomes a pathway to growth rather than a sign of vulnerability. Carl Jung deeply understood that human interactions often serve as mirrors, reflecting not just the superficial but the deepest recesses of our own psyche. When you recognize this, every interaction becomes an opportunity to strengthen your emotional core rather than a threat to your well-being. Have you ever noticed that the most sensitive triggers in relationships often touch upon themes of worthiness, love, abandonment, and acceptance? It's rarely about the surface-level issue, being ignored, misunderstood, or criticized. It's always something deeper. Jung would argue these deeper wounds date back to our earliest experiences, shaping unconscious patterns that direct our emotional reactions as adults. Imagine you grew up in an environment where love was conditional, dependent upon your behavior, success, or conformity. Unconsciously, you learned that your inherent value wasn't enough. You needed external validation to confirm your worth. As an adult, criticism or rejection, however mild, can reignite these old wounds, reinforcing a deep-seated fear. I'm not lovable unless I'm perfect, useful, or pleasing. This, according to Jung, is precisely how our past controls our present. Without awareness, you're condemned to repeat emotional reactions rooted in childhood experiences. But here's the crucial point. Your past shapes your reactions only until you become aware of these patterns. Jung famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Making your emotional triggers conscious is your first step towards emotional invulnerability. Let's consider a practical example. Suppose your partner, friend, or coworker criticizes something you've done. On the surface, it's a simple disagreement or critique, yet it feels disproportionately painful. You become defensive, angry, hurt, or withdrawn. Why? Not because the other person's words are inherently devastating, but because they resonate with something inside you, an insecurity you've long avoided or denied. Carl Jung taught that these moments of emotional turmoil aren't problems, they're signposts. They point you directly toward the wounds within you that need healing. When someone's words hurt, instead of immediately blaming or retreating, Jung encourages us to pause and ask, what inner wound is this touching? Consider the power in this question. Suddenly, you're no longer a victim to external circumstances. You're an explorer of your inner landscape. You discover that behind your emotional pain is often a hidden belief. I'm only valuable if I'm never criticized, or I must always meet others' expectations. The moment you acknowledge this belief, it loses some of its hidden power. According to Jung, integrating these unconscious beliefs into your conscious awareness reduces their emotional charge. You no longer react automatically from past wounds. Instead, you respond consciously from present awareness. Over time, this process builds an emotional foundation that external criticisms cannot easily shake. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or detached. Jung wasn't advocating emotional suppression, rather he championed emotional awareness. Genuine strength doesn't come from feeling less, it comes from understanding your feelings better. Hurtful words still sting, but now they serve as tools for self-discovery rather than weapons of destruction. Think about it practically. If someone insults you, and there's no echo inside your mind agreeing with their criticism, the insult holds little power. It's only when a hidden belief matches that criticism, confirming your deepest fears, that pain emerges. Thus, the key isn't to silence critics, an impossible task, but to address the critic within. This journey inward, facing the internal critic, is challenging. It requires honesty, courage, and vulnerability. Jung described this as confronting the shadow, the darker, rejected parts of ourselves. It means acknowledging traits you'd rather deny: envy, anger, insecurity, or fear. These aren't weaknesses to eliminate, but aspects of yourself to accept and integrate. When you integrate your shadow, something extraordinary happens. Your relationships become more authentic, less defensive. You no longer rely on others for validation, which paradoxically deepens genuine intimacy. People sense your authenticity and respond in kind. Your vulnerability no longer signals weakness. It demonstrates profound strength. Carl Jung observed that authentic relationships are only possible when both individuals have explored their inner worlds deeply enough to distinguish between what is real and what is projected. Many emotional wounds in relationships arise not from intentional harm, but from unconscious projection, expecting others to fill emotional voids within ourselves. By becoming aware of these projections, you reclaim your emotional independence. You realize that nobody can truly hurt you without your unconscious consent. Others' words and actions only hold power if they mirror unresolved issues within yourself. With this realization, relationships shift profoundly. You stop trying to control how others treat you and start controlling your internal responses instead. This is precisely how you build emotional resilience. External circumstances don't become less challenging, but your internal landscape becomes less reactive. Carl Jung would remind us, your ultimate power lies not in shaping the external world, but in mastering your internal responses. As you deepen your self-awareness, something unexpected emerges. Compassion, both for yourself and others. You recognize that hurtful behavior often originates from the other's own unresolved wounds. Their criticism reflects their internal struggles more than your shortcomings. Understanding this doesn't justify harmful behavior, but does liberate you from absorbing others' emotional baggage. In essence, Jung offers an invitation: transform emotional vulnerability into emotional awareness. Through this journey, nothing and no one can ultimately hurt you, because your sense of self-worth no longer depends on external validation. This shift doesn't erase pain entirely, but it transforms pain into wisdom, growth, and freedom. Carl Jung believed deeply in the transformative power of personal responsibility. He asserted that true emotional strength arises not from controlling external circumstances or other people's behavior, but from mastering one's internal responses. When you reach the point of genuine emotional self-sufficiency, your self-worth is no longer at the mercy of external validation or criticism. Achieving this level of resilience requires something profound: honest confrontation with your internal emotional landscape. Consider your typical reactions when someone criticizes, rejects, or disappoints you. Often you might instinctively feel hurt, angry, or defensive. On the surface, these reactions seem natural and justified. Yet, Jung would suggest that beneath these responses lie hidden fears or unresolved emotional wounds. These unconscious patterns perpetuate feelings of vulnerability and helplessness, because each new hurtful interaction reopens old emotional injuries. The transformative journey that Jung proposes involves asking yourself a difficult but vital question: what part of me believes this criticism to be true? Initially, your ego might resist such introspection. After all, it's easier to blame others than to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself. But Jung believed that the pain you experience isn't created solely by external forces. It stems significantly from internal beliefs and unconscious expectations. To illustrate this clearly, imagine being rejected by someone important to you, perhaps a romantic partner, friend, or employer. The initial sting of rejection feels personal, intense, and humiliating. It activates deep-seated fears about your worthiness, lovability, and belonging. Yet, according to Jung, what truly amplifies the pain isn't the rejection itself, but your internal interpretation of what that rejection means about your identity. I'm unlovable, worthless, inadequate. Jung argued that the root cause of emotional suffering often stems from attaching your self-worth to external validation or acceptance. Thus, rejection becomes devastating precisely because your sense of self is deeply tied to others' approval. Breaking free from this cycle requires shifting your emotional center from external validation to internal recognition of your intrinsic worth. How do you make this shift practically? Carl Jung provided a path, what he called individuation, the process of becoming authentically yourself by integrating all aspects of your personality, especially those you've suppressed or rejected. Individuation is about reclaiming lost parts of yourself, parts that you've ignored because they seem imperfect, undesirable, or incompatible with your ideal self-image. By integrating these parts, your fears, insecurities, and vulnerabilities, you cultivate a profound inner strength. Emotional resilience arises not by suppressing or denying these feelings, but by fully acknowledging and accepting them. Jung famously emphasized, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." This statement underscores the transformative power of conscious choice and emotional accountability. Think of individuation as a kind of emotional alchemy, transforming emotional vulnerabilities into sources of strength. When you're secure in your self-worth, rejection no longer signifies personal failure. Instead, it becomes simply another person's perspective or choice, disconnected from your intrinsic value. Your emotional equilibrium remains intact because you no longer allow external judgments to define your worth. Consider the freedom this provides. You can express yourself authentically without fear of rejection, knowing that your value remains constant, independent of others' opinions. You engage in relationships not from desperation for validation, but from genuine connection and mutual respect. Conflicts or criticisms still arise, but they no longer threaten your fundamental sense of self. To achieve this emotional state, Jung recommended deep introspection and regular self-examination. Each emotional trigger becomes an opportunity for self-awareness. Rather than reactively blaming others, you pause, turn inward, and ask, what insecurity or fear within me is being activated right now? By facing these questions honestly, you gradually dismantle the unconscious beliefs driving your emotional vulnerabilities. This inner exploration is challenging, requiring courage and humility. You might uncover uncomfortable truths about yourself, hidden insecurities, suppressed emotions, and painful memories. Yet Jung firmly believed that confronting these aspects is essential for emotional healing. He asserted, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Embracing emotional discomfort is necessary for authentic growth. Paradoxically, accepting your vulnerabilities and imperfections makes you emotionally stronger. Your self-worth no longer depends on projecting a flawless persona. You acknowledge your humanity fully, including its fragility and imperfections. People might still hurt or disappoint you, but their actions no longer define your identity. Instead, they simply reflect their reality, separate from your own inherent value. As you practice this emotional authenticity, relationships become healthier and more genuine. You're able to set clear boundaries, express your feelings honestly, and accept others' reactions without internalizing them. Emotional pain might still occur, but it no longer devastates your sense of self. Jung saw this state as true emotional freedom, being deeply connected to others without losing your own identity. Ultimately, Jung's teachings empower you to reclaim your emotional autonomy. You discover that your happiness, worth, and inner peace depend solely upon yourself, not on others' validation or behavior. This realization radically transforms your emotional resilience. You become emotionally untouchable, not because you're detached or uncaring, but because you're profoundly secure within yourself. In Jung's vision, achieving emotional resilience isn't about avoiding hurt or rejection entirely. That's impossible. Rather, it's about reframing these experiences as opportunities for growth. Every emotional pain becomes a chance to deepen self-awareness, integrate suppressed aspects of yourself, and build emotional strength. With this mindset, nothing and no one can ever truly harm you emotionally again, because your inner foundation is unshakable. You've learned the essential truth Jung championed. Emotional wounds are only devastating when they resonate with unconscious beliefs you hold about yourself. Once these beliefs are acknowledged and transformed, external criticisms lose their power. Thus, the journey inward, guided by Carl Jung's profound wisdom, is the path to true emotional invulnerability. Carl Jung emphasized repeatedly that the most profound emotional wounds are self-inflicted, not by intention, but through unconscious acceptance of beliefs imposed by society, upbringing, or past traumas. He observed that over time, we internalize external voices that subtly and persistently criticize, diminish, or invalidate our true selves. This internal critic becomes far more destructive than any external adversary, because it's always with us, reinforcing negative narratives silently and invisibly. To achieve true emotional resilience, Jung proposed confronting and transforming this internal critic into an ally. Think about how often you experience moments of self-doubt, anxiety, or feelings of inadequacy. Perhaps at work, you doubt your abilities despite evidence of competence. In personal relationships, you might question your worthiness of genuine affection. Even in solitude, critical inner voices whisper that you are not good enough, lovable enough, or valuable enough. Jung would argue that these self-doubts are not reflections of reality. They are echoes of past conditioning and unmet emotional needs that you've internalized and mistaken as truth. According to Jung, the source of emotional vulnerability is frequently a fundamental misunderstanding, the belief that your value depends on external achievement, acceptance, or validation. As a result, you become hypersensitive to criticism or rejection, interpreting even minor setbacks as personal failures. However, true emotional resilience emerges from reversing this dynamic, shifting from external validation to internal validation. This transition involves recognizing that your intrinsic value is immutable. No achievement or failure, acceptance or rejection can fundamentally alter it. To illustrate this shift, Jung introduced the concept of the shadow, the unconscious aspects of yourself that you repress or deny because they seem unacceptable, frightening, or shameful. The shadow encompasses traits like vulnerability, insecurity, anger, and resentment, qualities you often disown or hide. Jung asserted that true emotional healing and resilience require integrating these shadow aspects into your conscious self. Instead of fearing or suppressing them, you must acknowledge and accept them. This integration process involves deep self-reflection and compassionate self-awareness. When you feel hurt by criticism or rejection, instead of instinctively reacting with defensiveness or self-criticism, Jung encourages a different approach. Pause, observe your emotional reaction, and question it gently. Ask yourself, why does this hurt so deeply? What hidden insecurity is being triggered right now? What part of myself have I disowned or rejected? Initially, this inner dialogue might feel uncomfortable or even threatening. You might uncover painful memories, old wounds, or feelings of inadequacy you've spent years trying to bury. Yet Jung believed that confronting these uncomfortable truths is precisely what allows emotional healing to occur. He famously noted, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." By courageously bringing your shadow into conscious awareness, you dissolve its power over your emotional well-being. The criticisms or rejections from others become less impactful because they no longer resonate with deeply buried insecurities. You see these external judgments clearly as projections of other people's beliefs, fears, and limitations, not accurate reflections of your intrinsic worth. Consider the liberating impact this self-awareness brings. You're no longer captive to unconscious reactions, driven by hidden fears or unmet emotional needs. You no longer accept others' criticisms as personal truths, but rather as subjective viewpoints rooted in their own unresolved issues. You become emotionally autonomous, grounded firmly in self-understanding and self-compassion. Carl Jung described this state as genuine emotional maturity. You accept responsibility for your emotional experiences without placing blame externally or internally. You're neither a victim nor a perpetrator, but rather an empowered participant in your emotional life. Hurtful experiences still arise, but their emotional charge is significantly diminished because you've stopped unconsciously identifying with negative beliefs or judgments. In practical terms, emotional resilience doesn't mean you become indifferent or insensitive to criticism or rejection. It means you approach these experiences with greater clarity and emotional detachment. Rather than immediately internalizing or reacting defensively, you pause and ask, what part of me believes this to be true? More often than not, you'll discover an old narrative rooted in past wounds or conditioned beliefs, something you can now recognize and consciously choose to reject. This newfound emotional clarity extends beyond personal relationships to all areas of life. Workplace conflicts or professional setbacks no longer devastate your self-esteem. Instead, they become opportunities for growth, self-reflection, and conscious improvement. Your emotional responses become measured and thoughtful rather than reactive and instinctive. To maintain and deepen this emotional resilience, Jung recommended regular practices of introspection and mindfulness. Each emotional trigger becomes an invitation to deeper self-awareness. Each hurtful interaction becomes an opportunity to refine your emotional boundaries, clarify your values, and strengthen your internal sense of worth. Over time, emotional wounds become less frequent and less intense, not because external circumstances have changed, but because your internal emotional foundation is unshaken. Importantly, emotional resilience, as described by Jung, does not require isolation or emotional withdrawal. On the contrary, authentic emotional resilience enhances genuine intimacy and connection. Because your self-worth no longer depends on external validation, you're able to engage deeply and authentically with others. You're less defensive, more honest, and emotionally available without fear of rejection or hurt. Relationships deepen and improve precisely because you no longer fear emotional vulnerability. You embrace it consciously and courageously. Carl Jung's ultimate message is profoundly optimistic. Emotional wounds are not permanent conditions or inevitable outcomes of human interaction. They are temporary experiences, meaningful only because of the unconscious beliefs they illuminate. When these beliefs are transformed through conscious awareness and integration, emotional wounds cease to inflict lasting damage. You become emotionally resilient not by avoiding pain, but by transforming your relationship to it. Pain becomes a messenger rather than an adversary. a tool for self-discovery and emotional liberation. This perspective empowers you profoundly. Nothing and no one can truly hurt you again because you've reclaimed emotional authority over your inner world. Thus, Carl Jung's wisdom offers an enduring path toward genuine emotional invulnerability, a journey inward, toward self-awareness, integration, and unconditional self-acceptance. Building upon Carl Jung's profound insights, the path to emotional resilience involves not merely understanding yourself intellectually, but cultivating a deeply felt experience of your intrinsic worth. Emotional wounds and vulnerabilities often arise from a hidden belief that your value is conditional, contingent upon approval, acceptance, or external validation. Carl Jung insisted that genuine resilience is rooted in the unconditional acceptance of who you are, including all your imperfections, shadows, and insecurities. Achieving this requires a deliberate journey inward, guided by self-compassion and radical honesty. At the heart of Jung's psychology lies the principle of individuation, the lifelong journey toward becoming your authentic self. Individuation means consciously choosing to live in alignment with your inner truth, rather than conforming to external expectations or societal norms. Jung argued that emotional suffering is often a signal that you have deviated from this authentic path. Rather than viewing emotional wounds as signs of weakness or failure, he saw them as invitations to realign your life more closely with your true self. Consider for a moment how frequently you suppress your genuine feelings, opinions, or desires in order to gain approval or avoid conflict. Perhaps you silence your needs to maintain harmony in relationships or sacrifice personal ambitions to satisfy family expectations. Initially, these compromises might seem harmless, even necessary. Over time, however, they erode your emotional integrity, leaving you vulnerable to feeling hurt or rejected. According to Jung, the pain you experience in these moments isn't merely due to external actions. It stems primarily from your own self-abandonment. Reclaiming emotional strength thus begins by recognizing these subtle forms of self-betrayal. Each time you choose comfort or acceptance over authenticity, you reinforce a message deep within your psyche. My true self is less important than your approval. Jung emphasized that such unconscious beliefs must be made conscious and actively challenged. The moment you become aware of this internal dynamic, you regain the power to rewrite your emotional narrative. Practically, this means learning to express your truth clearly and compassionately, even at the risk of displeasing others. It involves setting healthy boundaries, saying no when necessary, and prioritizing your inner peace over external harmony. Initially, this might provoke discomfort or resistance, both within yourself and from others accustomed to your previous compliance. But Jung encouraged persistence through these initial challenges, recognizing them as essential stages of personal growth. As you become more skilled at asserting your true self, an extraordinary shift occurs. You stop perceiving external criticism or rejection as personal wounds. Instead, you recognize them as natural responses to your newfound authenticity. Some people may withdraw, feeling uncomfortable with your honesty or clarity. Others, however, will deepen their respect and appreciation precisely because you've become more genuine and emotionally grounded. In either case, you remain emotionally resilient, rooted firmly in self-acceptance rather than external validation. Carl Jung described this process of self-reclamation as holding the tension of opposites. On one side stands your conditioned self, safe, compliant, and dependent on external approval. On the other side is your authentic self, assertive, honest, and committed to inner truth. Between these two lies tension, uncertainty, and emotional discomfort. Yet Jung saw immense creative potential precisely in this tension. Instead of avoiding discomfort, he advised embracing it, recognizing that profound personal transformation happens within this challenging but fertile space. When you courageously inhabit this tension, emotional wounds begin losing their potency. Criticism or rejection becomes informative rather than damaging, showing you precisely where you are still vulnerable or unsure of your worth. Rather than retreating into self-doubt or defensiveness, you approach these moments as opportunities for deeper self-understanding. Emotional resilience grows stronger each time you respond consciously, compassionately, and courageously to such challenges. Furthermore, Jung emphasized that genuine emotional resilience is characterized by a compassionate relationship with yourself. Harsh self-criticism, judgment, or perfectionism will never lead to emotional strength. They perpetuate internal division and emotional fragility. Instead, Jung advocated cultivating radical self-compassion, particularly when you confront mistakes, imperfections, or setbacks. When you learn to embrace your flaws as inherent aspects of your humanity rather than weaknesses to overcome, you experience emotional liberation. This compassionate self-acceptance fundamentally transforms your relationships with others as well. When you stop judging yourself harshly, you become naturally less judgmental of others. When you feel emotionally secure within yourself, external criticism or rejection holds little power to unsettle you. Your interactions become characterized by emotional generosity, authenticity, and mutual respect, rather than fear, defensiveness, or emotional manipulation. This does not mean that emotional pain disappears entirely. You still experience hurtful situations, disappointments, and setbacks. However, your emotional reactions no longer derail your sense of self-worth or inner peace. Hurt feelings become transient experiences rather than enduring wounds. Jung would describe this as the hallmark of emotional maturity. You experience emotions deeply, authentically, and courageously, yet they no longer define or control you. Ultimately, Carl Jung's teachings offer a profoundly hopeful vision of emotional resilience. Rather than striving for emotional invulnerability, which is impossible, you cultivate a deep inner strength rooted in self-awareness, compassion, and authenticity. You accept emotional pain not as punishment or weakness, but as a valuable teacher guiding you toward greater self-understanding and personal growth. In Jung's words, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." In practical terms, this journey toward emotional resilience involves regular self-reflection, mindfulness, and compassionate self-care. You must regularly pause to ask yourself, am I living authentically? Am I expressing my true feelings and needs honestly? Or am I sacrificing my inner truth to gain external approval? By consistently returning to these questions, you strengthen your emotional resilience one conscious choice at a time. Thus, emotional resilience, according to Jung, is never a final destination. It is an ongoing practice, a continuous journey inward toward deeper self-awareness, greater authenticity, and unconditional self-acceptance. Each step you take on this path makes you less vulnerable to external wounds and more aligned with your true self. Carl Jung asserted that true resilience comes from understanding one profound truth. No external event can harm you emotionally unless you yourself grant it that power. On the surface, this might seem counterintuitive. Of course, hurtful words, rejection, betrayal, and criticism sting deeply. Yet Jung's point goes beyond immediate emotional reactions. He refers instead to the deeper narrative you create about yourself based on these external experiences. It's this narrative that either fortifies you or leaves you vulnerable to emotional harm. The heart of Jung's philosophy is that you hold the key to your emotional sovereignty. External events, regardless of how distressing, remain neutral until you assign them personal meaning. A rejection, for example, is just an event. It does not inherently signify your inadequacy. It's your interpretation, the meaning you attribute to the rejection, that determines its emotional impact. Jung argued that emotional wounds become enduring only when they confirm a pre-existing negative belief about yourself, such as being unlovable, inadequate, or unworthy. This is why emotional resilience requires not merely coping strategies, but deep introspection. You must become intimately familiar with your inner dialogue, the habitual stories you tell yourself about who you are and what you deserve. These internal narratives often develop early, shaped by childhood experiences, societal messages, and relationship dynamics. Jung emphasized that you must bring these narratives into conscious awareness, examine their validity, and actively rewrite them if you hope to become emotionally resilient. Imagine this practically. Someone criticizes your work. Initially, you feel a pang of hurt. According to Jung, this initial feeling is natural and unavoidable. Emotional resilience does not mean suppressing or denying pain. Rather, resilience emerges from how you respond after this initial reaction. If your inner narrative is rooted in insecurity, the criticism might trigger self-doubt, shame, or anxiety. You might replay the criticism repeatedly, amplifying its emotional harm. In contrast, if your inner narrative is fundamentally secure, you'll perceive the criticism more objectively, as useful feedback or simply one person's opinion, rather than a judgment of your worth. Thus, the key to emotional resilience lies in developing healthier, more empowering internal narratives. Jung believed this involved conscious, intentional work. You must challenge negative beliefs about yourself repeatedly until new, healthier narratives take root. For instance, when faced with criticism, instead of spiraling into self-doubt, you practice consciously reframing your thoughts. This feedback doesn't define me. My worth remains intact regardless of this external opinion. Initially, this reframing may feel unnatural, even disingenuous. That's normal. Jung emphasized that lasting change occurs through consistent repetition and conscious intention. Gradually, as healthier narratives become embedded, emotional wounds lose their sting. Events that once devastated you become minor disruptions, manageable and instructive rather than damaging. Emotional resilience, therefore, is not the absence of hurt but a transformed relationship with it. Hurt feelings still arise, but you no longer internalize them as reflections of your worth. Instead, you view emotional pain as a temporary signal guiding you towards self-reflection and growth. This shift from victimhood to self-empowerment is the cornerstone of Jungian resilience. Moreover, Jung recognized that emotional resilience profoundly transforms your relationships. When you no longer rely on external validation to confirm your worth, you engage with others from a place of strength rather than need. Your interactions become authentic, compassionate, and emotionally secure. Relationships built on emotional resilience are characterized by mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine empathy, precisely because neither party feels threatened or diminished by disagreement or criticism. This transformative resilience also enhances your capacity to support others. When you're emotionally grounded, you offer empathy without absorbing another's emotional turmoil. You hold compassionate space without sacrificing your emotional boundaries. According to Jung, this balanced, resilient stance is the highest form of emotional maturity. Importantly, Jung emphasized the role of self-care in cultivating resilience. He insisted that emotional resilience requires regular periods of solitude, reflection, and self-renewal. You cannot achieve true resilience through constant activity, external validation, or relentless productivity. Instead, resilience grows strongest in moments of stillness and introspection, when you step away from external demands to reconnect with your inner self. Practically speaking, this involves regular practices such as journaling, meditation, spending time in nature, or engaging in creative activities purely for personal joy. Jung believed these activities were crucial, not merely for relaxation, but for cultivating deeper self-awareness and inner strength. By regularly nourishing your emotional and spiritual self, you fortify your capacity to withstand external challenges without emotional harm. Ultimately, Jung's teachings about emotional resilience offer profound freedom. They liberate you from the exhausting quest for external approval, the perpetual fear of rejection, and the draining effort of protecting yourself from hurt. Instead, you recognize that emotional security can never be granted by another. It must be cultivated internally, nurtured through conscious self-awareness, compassion, and authentic living. In this Jungian view, emotional wounds cease being threats and become invaluable teachers. Each emotional challenge reveals areas where self-love and acceptance still need strengthening. Rather than avoiding emotional pain, you learn to welcome it as a necessary part of personal evolution. Jung saw emotional resilience not as armor against pain, but as the willingness to remain open, vulnerable, and honest, trusting that your inner strength would guide you through any hurt. In closing, Carl Jung reminds you, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. This inner awakening is the essence of emotional resilience. It ensures that nothing and no one can ever truly hurt you again, because your emotional well-being no longer depends on external circumstances. It rests securely in your authentic, compassionate, and deeply self-aware relationship with yourself.